All right, we're going to look at two of Marvell's great lyric poems, both related to the theme I already mentioned last time of nature, and specifically of the garden within nature, and all of the connotations that arise from that. I mentioned the element of Neoplatonism in Marvell's thought. Neoplatonism is chiefly associated with one writer by the name of Plotinus. Plotinus, to some degree, Christianized Plato's idea or realm of ideas, and connected the idea of the ideas with being, with the idea of being, such that in Plotinus's thought, often being was presented in the form of something akin to a fountain, in which being arose out of the fountain and was distributed and gave its various goods to the rest of creation. And you can see the presence of fountains in gardens in the neoclassical period, and it gets carried on into the Enlightenment, but certainly in the neoclassical period. And there is ideational significance to those fountains then. They're the repository of being, and of course, God himself is the author of being and is himself the essence of what being itself is. So in the theology of Thomas Aquinas, God is the definer of what being is, and all being arises from him. This becomes very significant. And of course, to some degree, it's picked up here in Marvell's thought. Now, back to the issue of nature. I did mention last time that in many ways, Marvell can be seen writing in the great tradition of pastoral poetry, and he can, which goes all the way back to Theocritus in the in Greek literature, and the idea of a realm in which is idealized. The rustic life of the shepherd is presented as some sort of an ideal to which even the urbanite aspires and sees as a something that he ought to wish to associate himself with. And this type of an appeal to this rustic life and as an idealized form of life is not an expression of realism, an idea that, and it's a self-conscious idealization of a life that, quite frankly, the poets, and most particularly their patrons, do not themselves actually generally experience, because they live in an urban setting. So it's often written for kings and aristocrats who function in a courtly setting. And yet the ideal is not a king in a courtly setting, but rather a shepherd and a shepherdess living in a rustic garden existence, in which the world conforms to their desires and satisfies them. And we can see this carrying on into the Roman period with Virgil in his eclogues. And I mentioned to you when we met in person that in his fourth eclogue, Virgil's fourth eclogue, we get something akin to language that sounds a lot like the book of Isaiah, where we see a lion lying down with a lamb, and where the fields no longer have thorns or thistles, where the earth gives forth its abundance without any labor, where a little child leads them even, which was seen by Christian writers as a sort of prophetic insight on Virgil's part. It might be, and of course that's how Dante saw Virgil's work, to the extent to which he put Virgil as his guide in his Divine Comedy. But we can also see this in biblical pastoral writing. So in Song of Songs, again, we have written for Solomon, or by Solomon, the idealization of his idea of love. And once again, we find it in a rural or in rustic setting. And so this becomes a very common feature, the idealization of a very primitive order of things, and yet not primitive in the sense of our later sense of a savage period, which gets tamed, but rather of an unfallen world. So it's a sort of the idea of a golden age, or a Garden of Eden, depending on whether you're coming from the classical world's worldview or from the Christian worlds. But Marvell is speaking to that tradition when he writes these two poems we're going to look at today. One, The Garden, and second, the Mower's Song. Let me put this up on a, share my screen with you, and I will read The Garden. And then we'll make some comments about it. So The Garden by Andrew Marvell. How vainly men themselves amaze to win the palm, the oak, or bays, and their incessant labors see crowned from some single herb or tree, whose short and narrow verged shade does prudently their toils upbraid, while all flowers and all trees do close to weave the garlands of repose. Fair quiet, have I found thee here, and innocence, thy sister dear. Mistaken long I sought you then in busy companies of men. Your sacred plants, if here below, only among the plants will grow. Society is all but rude to this delicious solitude. No white nor red was ever seen so amorous as this lovely green. Fond lovers, cruel as their flame, cut in these trees their mistress' name. Little, alas, they know or heed how far these beauties hers exceed. Fair trees, wheresoe'er your barks I wound, no name shall but your own be found. When we have run our passion's heat, love hither makes his best retreat. The gods that mortal beauty chase, still in a tree did end their race. Apollo hunted Daphne so, only that she might laurel grow, and Pan did after Syrinx speed, not as a nymph, but for a reed. What wondrous life in this I lead? Ripe apples drop about my head, the luscious cluster of the vine, upon my mouth do crush their wine, the nectarine and curious peach, into my hands themselves do reach. Stumbling on melons as I pass, ensnared with flowers, I fall on grass. Meanwhile, the mind from pleasure less withdraws into its happiness. The mind, that ocean where each kind does straight its own resemblance find, yet it creates, transcending these far other worlds and other seas, annihilating all that's made to a green thought in a green shade. Here at the fountain's sliding foot, or at some fruit tree's mossy root, casting the body's vest aside, my soul into the boughs does glide. There like a bird it sits and sings, then wets and combs its silver wings, and till prepared for longer flight, waves in its plumes the various light. Such was that happy garden state, while man there walked without a mate. After a place so pure and sweet, what other help could yet be meet? But 'twas beyond a mortal's share to wander solitary there. Two paradises 'twere in one, to live in paradise alone. How well the skillful gardener drew of flowers and herbs this dial knew, where from above the milder sun does through a fragrant zodiac run. And as it works, the industrious bee computes its time as well as we. How could such sweet and wholesome hours be reckoned but with herbs and flowers? So this is a delightful poem, and it's quite brilliant. And he begins the poem by engaging, and note that it comes in the form of rhyming couplets, very much in the classicist vein that Johnson himself would be pleased with. But he writes in terms that are now not really that which we would normally aspire to or ascribe to a classical writer in Johnson's vein. He is idealizing the garden, but he's also reflecting on the various ways in which gardens are utilized in various traditions. And one of the things he begins with is the idea of using certain plants from the gardens as symbols of other things. And in this case, line 2, the palm, the oak, or bays, as a crown for the victor of whether an athletic contest, or in his case, probably a poetic competition, much as we see in the portraits of the Olympians. And they use only an aspect of this. And this is the beginning of a theme for Marvell, that although we have given credit to nature, we have not done so sufficiently. We've not understood nature rightly. We haven't given it the reverence which it is due. Now, to some degree, you have to realize throughout the poem here that Marvell should not be taken too seriously. There's clearly an element of wit being used, and to some degree, very much tongue-in-cheek. So when at the end he talks about the paradise that was lost when Adam was created a mate, he's not speaking as a misogynist. He is speaking, as I say, rather tongue-in-cheek here, and talking about, again, an unfallen world, and as if the woman were part of the fall. And when he's using Neoplatonic imagery, which you saw referenced the garden, I'll talk about the bird and the tree as well as another Neoplatonic device. Once again, he is not wedding himself to a view of human anthropology in which the soul is really the essence of the person and the body is effectively a prison house for the soul. That would make him a pagan. That would make him a true Stoic, or any of the other post-Aristotelian views of philosophy that all are wedded to Plato's idea of the mind being the essence of the person and the body being non-essential. He's not, although he is referencing that and he knows it, he is employing it here more as a vehicle for thought and exploration without himself ascribing to that anthropology. He's most certainly not doing that. He's moving from one idea to the next in a very metaphysical way. So he begins with the idea of poetic fame and says that hitherto we had only used an aspect of nature, but there's a greater sense of nature which they have nonetheless missed. And that is the subject of the poem. And he comes upon it in its quietness. And so in the second stanza, again in rhyming couplets, fair quiet, have I found thee here, and innocence, thy sister dear. Remember, Milton's Paradise Lost begins of man's disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, which brought death into our world, and all our woe with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore it. And the loss of innocence, innocence in its Latin sense here of a lack of harm. There was no harm in the original state of the garden. Before man brought the harm in, it was harmless. He has sought quiet and innocence in the busy companies of men. Now he's going to retreat to the quietness and solitude of contemplation. This contrast that Marvell is making is one, again, that the classical world recognized between two types of life. There's the busy life of the politician, the vita activa, or the bios politikos, to use the Greek word. And on the other hand, there's the life of the philosopher / theologian, the vita contemplativa, or the bios theoretikos, if you again want the Greek term. He's found that in the place of contemplation and repose. This is a stock phrase. It's not Marvell's invention, but it's one that, again, we could notice that a poet like William Wordsworth will act as if he himself discovered for the first time by escaping society that he should find solitude in nature as a place where he could be most himself. This is not a new thought, but Wordsworth pushes it in a different direction. But again, that's because of Wordsworth's pantheism, and I'm not talking about Wordsworth here. We're talking about Marvell. But note, he says, your sacred plants, if here below, only among the plants will grow. Society is all but rude to this delicious solitude. Again, very much sounds like Wordsworth. He's driving a striking and stark dichotomy between society on the one hand and busyness and noise, and on the other hand, the individual and solitude and the rest of one's soul in that context. Again, Rousseau sounds the exact same as well. So very much seems to be anticipating that. But again, this is a note that's not new to those men. It is characteristic of pastoral poetry in general. He then goes on in the third stanza to the way in which nature has been portrayed in courtly love poetry, where the associations of love are often in terms of white and red. The woman's complexion being white, the roses in her cheeks, the redness of her lips, etc. And these are associated with again with love. And he says, no white nor red was ever seen so amorous as this lovely green. So this not only embodies nature, it embodies love. So now he's making, as I say, not only Neoplatonic connotations, but to some degree drawing them together with Christian implications, connecting being and love. But here, of course, they've desecrated nature in the past. So the lovers in the courtly love tradition inscribe into the trunks of trees the names of their beloved. He says, fond lovers, cruel as their flame, cut in these trees their mistress' name. Little, alas, they know or heed how far these beauties hers exceed. Fair trees wheresoe'er your barks I wound, no name shall but your own be found. So again, the idealization of nature and the idealization of love come together in Marvell's poem to this point. In the fourth stanza, he talks and invokes various myths that do exactly what he's doing here, which is connect love with nature. And he's drawing upon Ovid and his poem Metamorphoses here. Remember, Ovid was famous as an epic poet in this work, Metamorphoses, which is enormously influential in the medieval and Renaissance periods. But he is also famous for his Ars Amoris, and which are basically so scandalous that the emperor basically, and also for seducing his niece, that he threw him out of the court. But the two connotations of passion and nature are drawn together in the Metamorphoses. So he talks about Apollo and Daphne and Pan and Syrinx, and how they sometimes the nymphs turned into a plant to escape the god, and sometimes the god sought the plant directly as an implication of that. He moves on then. And in the next scene, we get something along the lines of a state of nature in which labor has been banished. In the pagan conceptions of the origins of life, this is how the world began, without labor, not only without war, but without labor. Things just naturally, spontaneously appeared, and that's how it happens here. It's as if he is rendered passive and nature is acting upon him. That moves to the next stanza, where the mind is now detaching from the body. So the contemplation and the action are literally dissociated, because the mind is separating from the body, like a bird sitting in a tree, or like at the verge of a fountain, where the body's vest is cast aside and the soul through the boughs glides and sits in this tree near the fountain, all of which, as I say, are associations of the plenitude of being, which is flowing and issuing forth life from it. And he says that this was the happy garden state in the beginning. Now, echoing or rather hearkening the reader's mind back to the Garden of Eden. That was the happy garden state when man walked without a mate. So Adam before Eve was created, contradicting what scripture says, that it's not good for man to be alone, quite self-consciously doing so, as I say, very much tongue-in-cheek, saying that this was so in the beginning. That was paradise when solitude was a real thing. And that was beyond a mortal share to be solitary like that. That was two paradises, to live in paradise alone. Again, very much, no doubt, laughing as he writes this. And but concludes it with along the same lines: how well the skillful gardener drew of flowers and herbs this dial knew, where from above the milder sun before the fall and before it became a scorching sun, does through a fragrant zodiac run. And as it works, the industrious bee computes its time as well as he. So it's a place in which space and time are no longer reckoned by mechanical means, a clock, but rather by nature itself, that in this case, the bee. And we can reckon our hours by herbs and flowers. So again, nature is to some degree being idealized, to some degree almost presenting itself as a form of tutor for us in a way that I think we could see Mr. Wordsworth echo in his later poetry. It's certainly a fit comparison worthy of making. I'm going to stop with that for now. I'll leave that on its own, and I'll then give you a follow-up video on the Mower song, and we'll see how he continues with that theme.